Peter Hitchens, the man himself, must-read columnist and author, joins me now. Peter, it's great to see you. In a sense, I guess, your tweet reminded us that empire is always with us. And if it's not the British, it's going to be somebody else. And when that somebody else is China, it's a bit ridiculous to be harping on about things that happened hundreds of years ago.
Well, yes, it is. I mean, I will defend some aspects of the British Empire, though not all of them, and always quote George Santayana, the Spanish-American philosopher, who said the world never had sweeter, more boyish masters, and that when the British Empire was finally swept away, a lot of people would be sorry, I think implying that what replaced it would be worse. Certainly what I have seen of the Chinese Empire is very dispiriting and worrying indeed. And I went, when it was still possible to do so, to Xinjiang, the territory formerly inhabited, still inhabited, but now as an oppressed people by the Uyghur Muslims some years ago, and was shocked by the way in which it was being treated even then. We all know about Tibet as straightforwardly invaded and taken over by China. And we see all the time China's increasing menace to its neighbors, and its clear intent to insert itself into large parts of the world, particularly Africa at the moment, which must end in it having greater prestige and power, and something which seems to me to look like an empire and walk like an empire and quack like an empire. And why shouldn't we call it that? If people are upset about the British Empire, and I accept many of the criticisms of it that people make, then that's fine, but it's dead, it's over. The empire that one should be worrying about at the moment is the expansionist and extremely dictatorial Chinese one. And why do we not hear more about it? I happened to be listening to the radio last night when news came over of the removal of that monument in Hong Kong, and I thought, well, here we have an actual open, deliberate suppression of the truth of the kind which Stalin used to go in for in his days as the head of the Soviet Union, and one which sent a very considerable shiver down my spine. And so that's why I tweeted what I tweeted. I thought, well, here they are. It's so blatant. They don't even care that we see this.
Right.
They do it, and they say, this is what we do. This monument, and indeed the memory of the whole event, is no longer allowed. You'll remember a few weeks ago there was that extraordinary episode of The Simpsons where the reference to the Tiananmen Square has been removed, of course, in any Chinese transmissions of it. There's nothing that they won't do to suppress news of this. And think of this, it's vitally important to me because I think it's a fascinating illustration of what's gone wrong with our foreign policy. In 1989, the same time as the Chinese Politburo decided that they would maintain their power by slaughtering their own people, the communist leadership in Moscow and indeed in East Berlin decided they would not do that to maintain their power.
Right.
Absolutely. But here's the thing: the response of the West to these two different approaches, the repeated humiliation of Russia, refusal to recognize that it's withdrawn huge amounts of territory, the continued ramping up of stories about how it's expanding when it's actually doing the opposite, and kowtowing to China, kowtowing, which I have to point out you do yourself. You refer to the Chinese capital city as Beijing, a completely absurd thing to do. You don't call any other foreign capital by its local name. You call it by its English name, and this is actually the result of a campaign by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which approached Western newspapers, and in one case we know of, the London Times, actually went and said, if you don't start calling it Beijing, we will withdraw cooperation from you. Imagine, just for a moment, if you would, the British Foreign Office going to Le Monde, the great French newspaper, and saying, if you don't stop calling London Londres and start calling it London, we will withdraw cooperation from Le Monde. Everyone would laugh. But in the case of China, not only do they not laugh, they do as they are told over and over again. And people do it. Everyone in the British media, except me, does this kowtow day after day, time after time, hour after hour. They don't even realize that they're doing the cultural cringe to China, common in our society, runs through everything we do and say.
Now, well, let me just pick up on that. The way I think it is true that all kinds of people, very powerful people, starting with Joe Biden and a lot of other G7 leaders too, do the kowtow. And you're quite right about Peking, Beijing. One shouldn't swallow changes like that. But let me ask you this then: why do all those people? Why do the most powerful people on earth, including big Hollywood studios and including the guys who make The Simpsons, all the way down to the most trivial thing, why do they do the big kowtow? Is it because they've figured China has already won and they're already number one, and it's best to get on side with the winners?
Well, you'd have to ask them. I mean, Lenin's view was always push in the bayonet. If you meet mush, keep pushing. If you meet steel, withdraw and try somewhere else. What the Chinese have found is that everywhere they push in the bayonet, they meet mush. They see a Western world which has no guts, which has no understanding of the nature of China and doesn't care. Of course, we have to trade with China. Of course, we have to coexist with China. Most of us, I think, would welcome the new prosperity of China as a great step forward for people who'd been had seriously poor and oppressed under Mao Zedong and had been endured many decades of horrible chaos. All these things are good, but that doesn't mean we have to accept that horrible regime and stop saying at every opportunity we have, this is not something we endorse or support, and offering as much criticism of it as we reasonably can. And what the Chinese find is if they resist this and they say, we're not, how dare you talk to the Dalai Lama, you do that again, we'll never speak to you again, people stop talking to the Dalai Lama. Call our capital Beijing, so speaking, they do as they're told. So the Chinese, by this, attain a kind of psychological mastery over us. I think people should resist it more. So I don't want a war with China, but I think that if we're going to deal with them properly, then we have to stop being so uncritical of them and be much, much more aware. In the days of the Soviet Union, we all knew, thanks to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, about the Gulag. Who knows what the Chinese Gulag is called? I'll tell you, it's called the Laogai. Who knows what the Chinese KGB is called, the Gungan? But nobody knows these things. It's time we knew them. It's time we were aware of them. We're constantly making the point. This is a tyranny we're dealing with here, and an empire too. But
let me push back on what you said about the economic expansion, Peter, because essentially we can't go to war with China. All the talk about war with China is ridiculous. For a start, as we've seen in Afghanistan, America's not capable, and nor its allies, of actually winning a serious war anymore. If it loses to goatherds, it's certainly going to lose to the Chinese People's Liberation Army. But also, you can't go to war with a country that makes everything in your house. And increasingly in the US, the UK, in Europe, more and more of everything we buy is made in China. Whether we're talking about aspirins, whether we're talking about the chips that run modern motor cars. We could declare war on China, and a couple of days later, we'd have splitting headaches because we've got no aspirin, and our cars wouldn't run, and we'd be kaput. Is it a good idea to actually mortgage the entire Western economy to the goodwill of the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I hope I haven't become so incoherent in my old age that you think I was just advocating war with China, because I thought I said about 3 or 4 times that I was against any such thing. We absolutely shouldn't be contemplating war with China. It would be a ridiculous thing to do. We have to coexist with this power, just as we coexisted with the Soviet Union. But that does not mean that we should be silent about its injustices and its imperial ambitions, or indeed be relaxed about all of them. We have to accept that China is bound to dominate its own sphere of influence, and there are things that one has to accept about a growing economic and political power, which is bound to happen, but that's different from say, kowtowing to it, cringing culturally to it, and pretending that it's not a despotism. In terms of trade, I think we made grave mistakes. I mean, I see the current world as the horrific love child of Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping, when we destroyed so much of our own manufacturing industry and accepted the enormous amounts of cheap imports from China as a substitute for that. So much of our manufacturing, one of the great ironies of the modern world is we go on and on in Britain about how we no longer produce lots and lots of carbon that we used to produce. That's because the industries which used to create the carbon, if you care about this sort of thing, have all gone to China, where they create enormous amounts of carbon on our behalf. I would hugely like for us to re-establish our manufacturing industry and not be so dependent on China, for instance. And that wouldn't be a bad policy to pursue. But absolutely not. And I'm shocked that you might think that I'd be recommending war with China. I can't be stupid.
No. I'm just saying I don't think war. You're less of a warmonger than I've been traditionally, but I've given the idea that we could win a war against China. Nobody seriously thinks that after the way it's gone for most of this millennium so far.